Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University, and I'm glad to be joined today for a conversation about Ron Deibert's new book, Reset: Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. And I'm very glad to be joined by the author himself, Ron Deibert, who is a professor, hi Ron, of political science at the University of Toronto and director of the Citizen Lab, which has been a leading voice on technologies, human rights, and global security. Ron has been a contributing author to more than 120 reports on cyber espionage, commercial spyware, internet censorship, and human rights. And Ron's research has been cited widely in global media with more than 25 front-page exclusives with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other leading outlets around the world. I think one of the reviews of this book put it quite well from Edward Snowden. No one has done more than Ron Deibert and his lab to expose the enemies of the internet, shadowy companies whose sole business is to make it unsafe for all of us. No one is better placed to explain the intersection of law and technology that makes these abuses possible and how we can put an end to them. Reset is the definitive narrative of where we went wrong and a last chance to make things right. So I thought that put it rather well. So we're very happy to be joined today by Ron and also by our colleagues Larry Diamond and Eileen Donahoe from the Global Digital Policy Incubator. Eileen Donahoe is the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator here at the Cyber Policy Center, and before that was the UN Human Rights Ambassador. So very well positioned to speak to many of the issues that this book raises. Larry Diamond is the co-lead for the Global Digital Policy Incubator, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and also serves as a senior consultant to the National Endowment for Democracy. So really a fantastic panel here. Before we jump into the details of this book, for those who are not familiar with the Cyber Policy Center, all of our research and teaching focuses on improving the governance of digital technologies and their impact on geopolitics, security, and democracy. We're home to about a half dozen programs, and all of the research and teaching is really focused on informing the policy agenda for governments, corporations, civil society, and academia globally when it comes to these questions of how best to govern digital technologies. We do these webinars every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. PST. And again, today is focused on the new book, Reset. Just a bit of background on that. It is an incredible exploration of the risks that new technologies pose to us as users, and as Ron notes in the book, also to our, as he frames it, relatively rare and fragile liberal democracies. And I think Ron nicely notes that these are in part by design, given challenges with ad-based revenue models, and in part unintentional, as we find these often highly insecure technologies being exploited by authoritarian regimes to infiltrate every aspect of our lives. One of the things that I particularly appreciated about the book is that it speaks both to the democratic and geopolitical concerns that we have often discussed here at the center, but also has a wide-ranging exploration of the environmental impacts of these technologies, something that has not been discussed as much in this forum, and what, Ron, you refer to as the overlooked underbelly of cyberspace. And I think 2 points that were particularly surprising to me that you noted: that one Google search accounts for as much CO2 emissions as boiling a cup of water in an electric kettle, which I found shocking, and that training a single AI model can emit more than 626,000 pounds of CO2 equivalent, nearly 5 times the lifetime emissions of an average American car. So really a wide-ranging set of issues brought up in this book. I think, Ron, that you note of most pressing concern the transformation in our policing technologies, what you frame as 21st century policing capabilities paired with 20th century oversight, something that I think Eileen and Larry will have much to comment on. And then the last thing I'll note before turning it over to discussion was that not only does the book cover a wide range of risks, but also devotes close to 100 pages on potential solutions, which is not often the case these days. And you frame these in 3 main categories: what you talk about as retreat, the opportunity to unplug or disconnect, or the hashtag delete Facebook movement; reform, corporate social responsibility, ethical design, fact-checking, media literacy. And then you speak, I think, most persuasively to the need for restraint of corporations and what they can do with our data, of governments and how they can surveil us, and of ourselves and each other and how we engage with these technologies. So really a fascinating exploration of potential solutions. So with that, I would love to turn it over, Ron, to you with thanks for writing such a great book and to have you share an overview of what the key highlights were from your view and the motivations for writing it. And then would like to turn first to Eileen and then to Larry for your questions. So thank you all so much.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for that wonderful introduction. That was fantastic. And you did a lot of my job for me, so I appreciate it. That was really succinct and accurate. Thank you, and thank you, Larry and Eileen, for agreeing to come on this panel. It's a great honor to be with you, as always. So Kelly talked a bit about the Citizen Lab. Let me just begin by saying, this is the bulk of my day job, is working with my amazing staff and researchers and colleagues at the Citizen Lab. For those of you who don't know, we do digital research on digital security issues that arise broadly out of human rights concerns. And the signature of the Citizen Lab is our mixture of methods. So I'm a political scientist by training. I'm an international security guy. That's my specialization. But the people who work at the Citizen Lab come from many different disciplines. We especially leverage techniques and methods from engineering science and computer science, but also law, policy studies, and area studies to do the work that we do. We've been described as a kind of digital watchdog, and I think that accurately characterizes the focus of our research. So we're independent from governments and companies. We see ourselves lifting the lid on what's going on beneath the surface of the communications ecosystem that surrounds us. We're not an advocacy group. Instead, we take very seriously the fact that we're based at a university. So we see our principal mission to put very careful, peer-reviewed, evidence-based research in the public interest. So, most of the work that I do is contributing as part of a team to these very carefully researched reports, which are very kind of clinical in nature. When I got the invitation to contribute this book, to write this book, I should mention that for those of you who aren't Canadian, you may not know about the context for this book. It's part of something called the Massey Lecture Series, which in Canada, where I'm based, is a very prestigious set of lectures that go back to 1961, I think it was founded, and has featured some, really mind-blowing people in the past, including Martin Luther King Jr., John Kenneth Galbraith, Charles Taylor, Ursula Franklin, Margaret Atwood. So to get an invitation to both deliver these lectures and write a book is a great honor, but it's also very daunting because growing up in Canada, the books that make up the Massey lectures were foundational to me. I read every single one of them. So it was honestly just completely surreal to be asked to do one, but it also gave me an opportunity to write in a different manner. So, as I said, I spend all my day doing these very clinical, careful reports that are very empirical in nature. And this was a chance to write for a different audience. These are meant for a large, public audience, not necessarily academics per se, although I hope they will like it too. So it's written in an engaging manner with lots of stories. And that was very fun. It was a nice kind of break from the usual routine. And in fact, I may never go back to writing referee journal articles again because it was so much fun. I had two aims in writing this book. The first was to summarize what I call the painful truths about social media that some of them Kelly alluded to. Truths, because I do feel there is a kind of emerging consensus. As I look out at the specialist literature out there, people do have disagreements, but I think generally speaking, there's definitely a gestalt in the air, right? There are hearings going on right now as we speak in Congress about social media. So everyone kind of senses something is wrong. And what I wanted to do was kind of bring these all together and lay them out in an engaging and accessible way. I call them painful truths because, you know, truths, do believe there is this conventional wisdom or emerging consensus that's coming together, but painful because when you actually add them all up and look at them, it is very daunting, right? You look at this and you go, oh my God. And I know I've had reactions to the book where people say it's absolutely terrifying. And that was, you know, intentional. I wanted to kind of lay bare, like, this is what we face right now. This is where we're headed. What are we going to do about it? I should say that the origin for this really I owe to Larry Diamond. So we were together at a conference in Senegal in West Africa. I can't remember exactly when it was. And I made some offhand remarks about the uncomfortable truths about social media. And he invited me to do them up into an essay, which then was published in the Journal of Democracy. And so when the Massey Lecture invitation came around, it was an opportunity for me to build these out. And yeah, there it is. Thank you. You know, the Journal of Democracy essay was the launching pad, I would say, for this book. And, you know, it covers some of the same material. I had a second aim, as I said, and that was to go beyond laying out these painful truths. So I found it certainly frustrating myself that when I would read about all of the problems having to do with the internet, social media, et cetera, you know, the diagnosis was clear, you know, identification of symptoms is well done, but very rarely, as Kelly said, would there be solutions and or at least, you know, a good clear explication of solutions. That's not to say that there are none out there. I mean, they're plentiful. They're all over the place. And it's hard to kind of figure out, well, which ones make sense? You know, they seem kind of ad hoc, often reactionary, kind of fragmented. And so my second goal was to kind of pull together not so much a series of recommendations. There's not a list at the end here. I didn't want to do that. Instead, what I wanted to do was to remind people about a philosophical framework that might help tie all of these different proposals together and give us a kind of recipe for how to think about solutions. And of course, you know, I nod to some here and there, but basically my intent was to lay a foundation. And in order to do that, I draw from my political theory background and pull in a central principle, as Kelly talked about, restraint, which is, you know, a very seemingly simple concept. Everyone knows what it means in the common sense of the term. But what many people might not know is that it is a principle that is at the heart of liberal theory, and in particular, liberal Republican theory, and goes back all the way to ancient Greece, and has been used as a way to think about preventing the abuse of power. In terms of, you know, the book itself and reset, I felt like we needed to reinvigorate the principle of restraint, re-examine what it means, and apply that principle to restraining both the private sector, which of course, you know, wield enormous influence over our lives, and governments and policing, as Kelly talked about, which I think is one of the most, you know, it's in our face, but it's also one of the most overlooked aspects of the great changes that have happened in digital technologies, that it's contributing to this great leap forward in capacities of state control without compensating safeguards to prevent abuse. So we have, you know, policing capabilities going like this, and safeguards have remained more or less like this. And of course, that gap is a big accountability problem. It's a big problem for safeguards against the abuse of power. So that's the book, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with all of you, people that I respect enormously. And thank you to, wow, it looks like 70 people tuning in right now. Looking forward to talking to all of you too. Thank you.
Great, Ron, thank you so much for those remarks. Eileen would love to turn it over to you and then to Larry for questions, and then we'll save about 20 minutes, maybe 30 at the end for questions from the audience. If you want to go ahead and put them in the chat, for those you're particularly interested in, you can upvote them, and I'll try and attend to those first, and we'll moderate those once Eileen and Larry have had a chance.
Actually, I'm just giving my takeaway from the book as a starting place. And first point I have to make is Ron is such a rare person, not only brilliant and passionate, but as Larry said earlier, such a great writer. I mean, to reduce this with such clarity for all of us, I mean, it was awesome for people like me. I'll put it that way. First point is I loved the title and the core purpose of the book, to reclaim the internet for civil society, which sounds so obvious in the circles we travel in, but I think many people don't understand that should be the core purpose. And so the subtext for me is that the internet should not primarily exist for the benefit of private sector companies to make money, for authoritarian governments to repress citizens, or even democratic governments to sort of drift unconsciously into their own unrestrained use of data without even understanding where they're going. I also see the book essentially as a wake-up call for democratic governments, a reminder that it is their job to protect the liberty and security of citizens, even in our dramatically changed digital society. For me, the book has sort of three core functions. A history lesson on the evolution of the internet, which has really morphed before our eyes in a really short period of time. Even the meaning of the term the internet has changed dramatically. And I see it, Ron's really talking about digitized society, digitization of everything. And that has come to be sort of the new meaning of the internet. As we've already heard, rich description of pathologies of the current internet, and then a strong steer on solutions moving toward the liberal tradition and the principle of restraint. So I just want to really touch on each of these, but emphasis on this history, which was really fun to have you paint that picture of the different phases of the internet, and how the current internet is so different from that early internet of the John Perry Barlow libertarian phase, when the internet was really about interoperable hardware and software protocols that were, in fact, beyond the reach of any government trying to assert sovereignty. It did exist for a moment. It's also different from the internet, where many of us met in that sort of liberal phase at the height of the internet freedom movement, sort of 2010, 2012, where the presumption was that the internet would always disproportionately benefit civil society. You remember the headlines from the Arab Spring, liberation tech and democratic revolution through social media. In that phase, authoritarian governments like China, Iran had started to assert some sort of national sovereignty, but we presumed they were in a losing battle. And that was also the phase when democratic governments came together to form the Freedom Online Coalition, thinking that they would be the champions and protectors of human rights online. Next phase is the bombshell of the Snowden revelations, which changed everything. And on some level, we have never gone back, never recovered, because it made the hypocrisy of democratic governments so visible, especially obviously the United States. And at that moment, this coalition of democratic governments and the Freedom Online Coalition turned completely inward and became self-preoccupied, but never really were able to articulate what should be the lines on use or collection of data for themselves or the private sector. In that phase, there was fantastic work being done by civil society, I will say, on those principles of restraint. If you remember the necessary and proportionate principles for surveillance, that project was outstanding. And it's kind of a model of what we need to do today with respect to everything. And I also remember being in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia together at the Freedom Online Coalition. And we were all talking about, bringing a human rights lens and having a paradigm shift with respect to cybersecurity. But that was when Ron chose to walk out, and he sort of was the canary in the coal mine saying, this coalition is not going to cut it. Obviously, 2016 was the next bombshell and completely changed our view of cybersecurity. And that was a real wake-up call to the national security community. And then that gets us, I feel like we've been preoccupied with disinformation ever since 2016, but the problems are so much broader. And that's where Ron's description of the pathologies come in. And the ones that really struck me are this idea of security as an afterthought, which has left society incredibly vulnerable: infrastructure, data, communications. In retrospect, this is really a dramatic form of negligence to have not built in security in technology we all use and are more and more dependent on. The second piece is obviously the model of surveillance capitalism and the appropriation of citizen data without any recognition of its value to the citizens, either monetarily or in terms of identity, liberty, security, any of those things. Then there's the model of monetization of attention in social media, which has created, as you call it, this cesspool of civic discourse and dramatic erosion in the quality of civic discourse. And then last but not least, you talk about the fusion of all these different sources of data, creating new forms of manipulation and that really present a threat to human autonomy looking ahead. I think the key insight of the book is that this is all happening in democratic societies. And it stems back to that lack of rules. Even at the same time, this is something Larry and I are thinking a lot about, we see this model of techno-authoritarianism on the rise with its promise of control over citizens through technology. But it's really about getting our own house in order first. And so luckily for us, you didn't just stop with that rich description, because that's where most people are, that admiring the problem phase. And I love your core idea about returning to the roots of the liberal democratic tradition, especially the deep appreciation of the value and purpose of restraint on power, combined with shared civic values, which we obviously no longer have. And I think the challenge for us is getting people excited about the concept of restraint and process principles like checks and balances, adherence to the rule of law, transparency, independent oversight, all these things. I think the task is getting other people to recognize how potent those tools really are. And most people don't recognize that. Last point I'll make. Here we are 1 week before our election. And in the book, you do talk about Donald Trump as really the epitome of all these pathologies coming together in one person. He's sitting at this center of that social media cesspool with aggression, manipulation, craving attention. He's also a model of an authoritarian leader who rejects restraint on power. And my one bit of optimism is it may be that Donald Trump has made it all so visible and so very unattractive that there are an increasing number of Republicans who are recognizing that abuse of power and lack of restraint and lack of civility is not what we want and shouldn't define who they are. And I would add to that many in the national security community are recognizing that if we actually want to compete against China's model of digital authoritarianism, we have to differentiate ourselves based on our values, commitment to human rights, and restraint on power. That is the essence of what differentiates us. And the idea is we should win with that approach, that we will be stronger for it. It'll make us more secure. So hopefully I'm not completely naive in that regard.
Thank you, Eileen. And Larry, would love to turn to you next.
Well, I'll make it interesting by saying, Eileen, I think you may actually be a little bit naive in that regard. I think that even if we have a rotation of power in the United States and a clear and more forcefully stated recognition that we need to put our values first, as you did in Geneva for the United States of America, in terms of human rights and so on, there will be enormous pressures on a Biden administration from the actors that Ron is talking about in this book, and particularly the powerful internet corporations, to not change the basic infrastructural model of surveillance capitalism. The momentum here is staggering. And I begin my remarks by quoting actually someone who knows this industry pretty well, although I think her quote was meant in a more traditional and larger political context, Laurene Powell Jobs, who said in a commencement address a few years ago, power is stubborn. It has to be moved, and it can only be moved by us. And the us, of course, is democratic civil society, which is really the audience, I think, to which Ron addresses this eloquent book. Let me say to my academic peers and colleagues in the Cyber Center and beyond, there's only one reason why you shouldn't read this book. And I think everybody interested in the challenges that digital media pose to humanity and democracy must read this book. But the only argument against doing so is, now I will speak personally, you may have the reaction that I had, which is, number one, you'll sigh and say, good Lord, I'll never write a book that good. And secondly, you'll say, I'd wish I'd written that book. This is the best book I have written, I've read on the internet and democracy. And I think among the exciting and impressive profusion of books we're seeing on the internet and democracy, particularly as a monograph, it is unique because of who Ron is and the voice he brings in an interdisciplinary fashion, crossing the three big legs of the university, of the academy. The leg of the social scientist that he is, and a truly excellent one. I mean, he's a very serious political scientist and scholar of international relations, and now of the politics and social relations of the internet and social media. Secondly, the technology of this, which the Citizen Lab is, of course, an innovator on in defense of our values, and which Ron, as a non-technologist, I think has pretty deeply mastered. But third, and what comes out in this book to a degree that I kind of knew from interacting and talking to him, but comes with a depth and nuance that is astonishing to me, and I think is, the silver gleaming lining through the whole book is the humanities side of this, the political theory side of this, and the deep commitment to liberal democratic, which is also to say, in the restraint sense of Ron's framework, Republican values of limited government and restraint of power. And it's when you put these three things together that you have the intellectual and moral framework to respond to the awesome challenge we face of, I repeat, runaway, largely unrestrained surveillance capitalism, which, Eileen, you rightly note, may be being pushed forward at lightning speed by the People's Republic of China, but largely has its base, its logic, and its origin in the advanced industrial democracies, and including the United States. Although I do reserve a special place, I'm going to say explicitly, for another country that I love and feel some identity with, Israel, which I think has been a unique offender. And Ron has a great vignette in here in his book in terms of the former people who'd been involved in the digital sphere of the intelligence apparatus in Israel, really committing some of the worst sins of distributing this high-tech surveillance technology and intimidating civil society that's trying to restrain it. Well, we come back to school here and we do our 3 R's. For Ron, the 3 R's are retreat, reform, and restraint. Eileen, I know you like to retreat now and then, and I'm going to need it after this election. So I'm going to ask you for some advice on a kind of personal repair, digital retreat response at the end of the year. But, I suppose you could have quoted Winston Churchill, Ron, in saying simply, retreat is not an option. It can be great for our temporary personal health, and it can be restorative in a limited sense, but we're not going to cut ourselves off from these digital tools. We can't live that way any longer, and we'll lose, as Ron eloquently says, all the good things that come with social media and digital tools. Reform, the corporations and the governments improving and checking themselves, as with the review panel that Facebook has created, can have some welcome limited impact, but it's not going to be the solution, because you never get powerful actors, or in this case, pretty damn near monopoly actors in certain spheres, particularly Google and Facebook, that successfully restrain themselves. I repeat, Laurene Powell Jobs, power has to be moved. I'll add, power has to be restrained, the chief insight of our constitutional founders. And, power actors are not going to successfully, out of the goodness of their hearts, restrain themselves. They can only be restrained by us. And those restraints, Ron makes clear, need to put individual rights, civil liberties, accountability, and democratic control first. And they need to have the overarching logic of restraining surveillance capitalism. Before I conclude somewhat briefly with a few ideas on, in reaction to the kind of hidden agenda, I understand why Ron didn't want to end with a 12-point program, but it is kind of buried in there if you want to pull it out. I want to say that a reason why I like this book so much is just the ringing quotes that will live in your mind, through the rest of the academic year at least. So here's my favorite. Fact-checking, which of course we're not saying we shouldn't be doing, but the reason why it's such a limited response is fact-checking is kind of like ideational pest control. As lies spread like cockroaches, we call in the exterminators. But if the kitchen is always dirty, the cockroaches will just keep coming back, which keeps pest control operation in business. So that's the kind of logic we're dealing with. And it leads to one of my favorite lines from any movie, Roy Scheider, when he first saw that shark coming out of the water. You remember his line in Jaws 1, we're gonna need a bigger boat. And I think that's really the message of this book. And the bigger boat, which is really a conceptually different kind of boat is we're going to need restraint. We're going to need restraint of governments, restraint of the corporations, and restraint of ourselves. That, in a sentence, I think, is the single most important message I take away from the book. And restraint is going to probably require several different kinds of independent, imaginatively constructed and insulated oversight or regulatory boards. For example, he recommends an independent oversight board for these zero-day backdoor tools that government intelligence agencies are demanding that could be composed from legislators, I will say maybe people who used to be on the inside and know how it works, all designed to ensure that governments report to software vendors the vast majority of vulnerabilities they discover, and that when they do withhold them as assets, such oversight could guarantee that they do so, the magic language here, infrequently, proportionally, and for reasons clearly justified by the public interest. I see Eileen kind of smiling now because I know how much that borrows from the principles of international human rights law. A regulatory agency for facial recognition, and I would just say more generally, I think probably I've got to wrap up soon, some kind of, this is me talking now, master consumer protection board, like the one we created for financial services, that is really going to have the interests of democratic citizens, the interests of consumers, and not the interests of the internet platforms or the government first. Some very interesting ideas in here, again, hearkening back to the logic in our Constitution of friction, of slowing things down, of having checks and balances, of building friction into the apps themselves, like WhatsApp has done to limit the size of groups, the number of times content could be forwarded, and so on. The key, Ron says, quoting again, will be to make sure that social media platforms manage content in ways that are transparent, limited, proportional, and music to our hearts at GDPI in compliance with internationally recognized human rights. Okay, so finishing on his final point about cultivating civic virtue, let me say now, with an appeal to Kelly again, to please arrange a seminar with our colleague and friend in the School of Education, Sam Weinberg, who really has been working on trying to cultivate civic virtue in the schools in terms of, you know, civics more generally, but also in terms of responsible citizenship in cyberspace for the internet age. And Ron has a lot of interesting and elevating principles and ideas here on how citizens could be encouraged to see ethics, civility, social tolerance, and respect for difference as part of what creates a healthy public sphere, and what must do so on the internet and in the management of our personal data. I will just say, I have come to the conclusion that, like sex education, this has got to start in grammar school. We cannot wait till secondary school to begin training these kids on the danger and the sewer of misinformation, rumor, and attention addiction that is out there. We've got to begin forming these habits at the earliest possible age so we socialize citizens to be responsible netizens. Thanks for writing this book, Ron. It's just awesome.
Wow. Thank you so much, Larry and Eileen. I'm blown away. I feel like just like going to bed right now and calling it a day, because anything I say will just be a long drop after those remarks. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everybody here. I appreciated, Eileen, your optimism, Larry, your pessimism about the ability to write such a good book on all of our parts, and your concerns about what Biden will face also. To your point about Sam Weinberg and media literacy, that will be on December 2nd at 10 a.m. And you are most welcome to join as a speaker, Larry. So watch your back if you keep suggesting these things. I'm going to keep calling on you. So I will announce that at the end of the conversation today. We also had a great conversation with other leaders in the media literacy and digital literacy field a week or two ago, and that conversation is up on our website. I wanted to note also some of your points about consumer protection and what can be learned from the financial industry, and there have been some really interesting analogs to FINRA and how that was developed lately that I would love to host a discussion on sometime soon. So some great questions coming in here, and please feel free others to add to those. The first from Ann Clunan, who is here at CSAC at Stanford with us. A great question that I think is on many of our minds: is it too late? And what are the conditions that make achieving these kinds of societal political restraints and self-restraint possible, and what have made those possible in the past? Are those present today? And if not, what could bring them into being?
Shall I go ahead on that one?
Yes, please.
Is it too late? That's a good question. You know, as I said at the outset, when you step back and you line up these various pathologies, it feels very overwhelming. And I think there is maybe even a human instinct to kind of resign in the face of that daunting challenge. And, you know, it's exactly the same as with respect to the challenges around climate change. And I draw analogies between the two. And I think we're at a similar stage to the recognition around what we face existentially from climate issues as we do now with digital technologies and social media. We're kind of at an earlier stage, and we've been thinking a lot about the problems, and everyone say, well, what do we do instead? What's your solution? And that's why I spent a lot of time kind of laying out what I thought would be a good starting point, a bedrock, if you will, a foundation to at least get the principles in place to start, debating particulars. So I don't think it's ever too late. I think the alternative would be really quite drastic, and so we may want to throw up our arms in despair. But what else are we going to do? I think we need to work on this. And actually, while Larry and Eileen are together with me on this panel, I will admit that one of the biggest challenges I had in writing this book was around the international relations part of it, and that solution set, if you will. And it's interesting, Eileen, you remind me about the Mongolia episode, because I was really disillusioned, as both of you had the same experience as I did throughout the kind of 2010s and even a bit earlier. We spent a lot of time together at these forums, at these cybersecurity summits, at these internet human rights meetings, and I would come away just shaking my head. All of these well-intentioned bureaucrats from governments, usually from the poorly resourced human rights divisions, are saying all these nice things, but I go back home to Toronto and I look around, and that's not what I'm seeing in Canada. It's not what I'm seeing in the United States. Their practices don't bear out what they are saying on paper. And equally frustrating for me were the cyber norms conferences, where people would talk about these aspirational norms, and meanwhile they're violating them left, right, and center. So I kind of backed out of all of that. I thought this is a waste of my time. And so when I came to the book and was thinking about, well, logically we need to deal with this on an international level. That's obvious, because companies can play jurisdictions off of each other. We have, of course, the looming really daunting prospect of China in this equation and the market it represents. So we do have to, at some point, confront international regulation, international rules. But we can't do it until, as Eileen said, we get our own house in order. And that's why I advocated for starting locally. So to answer the question, where do we start? I think all of us have to start with what's right in front of us, beginning with our own behavior, our own demeanor, and how we think about ourselves as being part of a collective, right? And how we treat that device in front of us. I mean, it's unfair to some degree to put onus on individuals to solve everything. That's not realistic. In the same way that we can't expect individual practices to change the problems around climate science or climate change. We need structural changes, but still we need to focus on our own habits, our own behaviors, and our own practices. And so what I advocate is to start locally in your own municipality, in your education systems, and in reforming and restraining local police, and work outwards from there.
Thank you, Ron. I think your point in your book about putting the onus on people to solve these problems and the sort of trivialization of consent that we've seen really resonated. Okay, we have 4 or 5 other questions. I'm going to start by grouping 2 of them, which have to do with the funding. And we've seen a lot of conversation lately about how problematic these business models are, that advertising-based, data collection-based business models are sort of the fuel or the engine for surveillance capital. We've also seen some interesting proposals lately. I think Ethan Zuckerman and our colleague Lucy Bernholtz over at the Digital Civil Society Lab have talked a lot about the possibility of a corporation for public broadcasting equivalent in the software space. And so would love to hear all of your thoughts on just how problematic this business model is, and if changes to that business model might help to address the fundamental problems.
Would one of you like to go first on that one?
I think you should go first every time, because your book is the center of this session.
Okay, well, I'll try to be, if that's okay with you, Eileen, I'll try to be brief. Yeah, I think, definitely these pathologies, the way I see them, it's like a giant machine, and each of the pathologies are like gears, interlocking mechanisms. And at the heart of it, at the heart of the engine of the machine is surveillance capitalism. Unless we reform surveillance capitalism, all of the other stuff will be kind of window dressing or shifting the deck chairs. So we really need to get at that. There are many different ways we can get at that, and I won't list them all here, but I really like this. You mentioned Ethan Zuckerman and other people talking about alternative platforms. Recently, there was an essay written about the idea of an analogy from national parks. Had I had more time with the book, I would have really gone into depth about the concept and the history of national parks and what they meant in terms of civic virtue and the idea of the collective, and of course, creating a space that preserves and conserves our connection to nature. There is no reason why we can't have platforms that are well-funded. It would have to come, in my view, from a mixture of public and private funds, like a PBS model, whose aim is to connect people in the social interest, in the public good. Right now we're assuming that, well, the only reason these things work is because of, the large-scale network effects of these giant monopolies. Well, that hasn't really been proven. Alternatives haven't been tested. And if we put enough resources and thought into it and architect it in such a way that it's explicitly a public good, something that's not about making money, it would have a different rule set. It would have a different feel to it. And I think it could vastly improve the ecosystem. It's an experiment I very much applaud.
Can I throw an additional question in there, Larry and Eileen, as you go to answer this, that is related, because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. Challenges with usage of such a public good, right? And so even if we were to create it, would they come? Would people eat their broccoli? Or given what we know about people's higher engagement metrics for really emotionally stimulating content, and what we've seen, sort of 6 times more engagement with emotionally triggering content, even if we built it, would they come?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Compare the audience of PBS with the audience of Fox News or MSNBC, and I think you've got the answer to your question. I think the ratio is at least 10 to 1, but it's probably bigger. And I think you'd have the same dilemma if you created a a public good, a social good, more reflective, and if I can say so, virtuous social media platform. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do so. And I think that maybe the most natural way to do so might be to build it out from public broadcasting in our democracies. I also think we should build out an international component of international broadcasting from PBS, but that's and modernize it in a variety of ways. That's a different story. Let me say that once you start fragmenting platforms further, and I think we are going to see that, things could get even more dangerous in some respects. I think if Trump loses on November 3rd, next Tuesday, there's a very good chance that he's going to start some sort of media enterprise and possibly his own social media platform. And that a lot of the bile, venom, QAnon conspiracy theorizing and so on, that maybe we can get Twitter and Facebook to gradually take more and more initiative to purge, regulate, expose, and control, might gravitate over to unfiltered platforms. And then you could say, well, we'll pass laws to regulate them. And Ron, I find your model, both the pros and cons of the model of treating some of these platforms like public utilities, really quite interesting. But in contrast to a public electricity utility, you can't pick up a public electricity utility and operate it from Moscow. You could do that with the social media platform that was getting overregulated in the United States. And obviously, we're not going to do what China does and create a great firewall that's going to ban access to it. So I think the dilemmas here are really going to be formidable.
Well, thanks, Larry. It's always a little pessimistic. I'm going to turn to Eileen and see.
So on that last point, I guess I would say the starting place, rather than thinking about alternative social media platforms, I think the really big issue is more the whole surveillance capitalism model and the appropriation of data by everybody, everything, all the time. And I think, the model of mindless consent that we've all given into. I mean, GDPR is held up as this great privacy protection, and yet it hasn't radically changed anything. It's just like we have one more step to go through. So this is the part of me that looks for something possible is the whole model has to be flipped, where it becomes visible to citizens that their data is valuable and it belongs to them. And also that it is essential, it's an aspect in digital society of their identities and their autonomy and their liberty and their security, all of it. And somehow I think we've got to make that more visible to people. I don't think we can rely only on government stepping in with some sort of reform or regulation, or even the existing platforms themselves. I think we've got to come up with something that's attractive to citizens. And we've also got to inspire the technologists that there is another avenue out there, a radically different business model, and based on protection of data. So I know it's flipping it. It's flipping the concept.
It's a model, but it's going to be less profitable, and therefore they're only going to settle for it because they're legally compelled to do so. Can I just say, to follow up, I think that we're actually making some contributions and blazing some new trails at Stanford with the kind of teaching that Rob Reich, Jeremy Weinstein, and some of our colleagues are doing on the ethics of AI and social media and so on. And to all of our colleagues who are teaching at the university level on this, I would pose the following challenge. How can we take some of these core principles and generate curricula that can be introduced at least in simple, principled ways, beginning, in elementary school, and then with more sophistication in secondary school, and then with even more breadth and sophistication in university education. If we don't start early in inculcating these principles, true for responsible citizenship in cyberspace as it is for responsible citizenship generally in a democracy, we're just going to be lost. Then it really will be too late by the time, they've fallen into the matrix.
So there were two great sort of points brought up just now, multiple great points brought up, two that relate to questions that have come up. I'm going to try and hit those quickly. We only have about 4 or 5 minutes left. And so perhaps a bit of a lightning round. The point that you just brought up, Larry, about curriculum and how do we start training youth, I think is a really interesting one. There was also a question that came up beyond youth. How can we think about other forms of media literacy? And, we had a conversation recently, I think it was David Rand at MIT, who's been doing some very interesting studies about how do you distribute. One of my greatest concerns about media literacy has been both the scale and the time lag, and then the concerns if you're not doing it through school of sort of preaching to the choir, where you end up getting people like us who are naturally inclined to more moderate viewpoints to opt to attend. So there have been ideas about distributing media literacy through the platforms so that you can meet the scale of the solution, match that to the scale of the problem, and some interesting data around nudges and how even just a simple prompt like, do you think it's important that the quality of the information you share is, high, can really change people's engagement behaviors. So a quick question of other media literacy resources that you guys are aware of, and that will, I think, answer this question from the audience. Anyone else aware of other things? If not, I can throw some up into the chat box.
I just want to say, go ahead. Go ahead,
No,
Ron.
go ahead. You go, Eileen.
I'll say the one thing to me is in your book, it's not emphasizing only media literacy or digital literacy. It's about civic education and going back to the roots and the values. That is such an important part of what's been lost in terms of engagement of citizens and how we think our so-called public servants, elected officials, should behave. And so I think that's a really big piece of it. I will also quickly say on the it's too late thing, I keep thinking back to human rights tradition. It took World War II, the crisis of World War II, to get us to create that foundation. And if we don't want a crisis of that proportion, we've got to do something. And I think Ron's point, there's a geopolitical dimension to this. We've got to get our own houses in order, but we cannot take our eye off that international realm where, even if we could get our own houses in order, we will be left in the minority. So, and that's not good for the globe.
Okay, I am realizing we are very short on time here, so wanted to just turn it to a last round of comments from each of you, and then we'll follow up on one question at the same time, which was, the feasibility of actually getting any legislation passed, given how important a role these tech companies play in our economies, and also what significant contributors they are, at least in the US, in terms of lobbying. I think both Facebook and Google are now in the top 10 lobbyists in the US, each around sort of 20 million a year in contributions. So comments on the feasibility of regulation and any last thoughts from each of you?
Go ahead, Ron.
Well, feasibility, I do share Larry's pessimism, I'll say. I think that we have an obligation as people who, spend all of our lives immersed in this stuff and are scholars of it to lay out the scope of the challenges that we face. And, to say, look, if we really are serious about reforming this, there's not one simple solution. It is going to take a holistic approach that covers more than just technology itself, as Eileen is talking about. That was one of the main things I wanted to get at with this concept of restraint. It had this other aspect to it, which is about civic virtue, we tend to default to, blaming the platforms and saying, if only they did this, when in fact, that would be a partial solution too. So we need to remind ourselves of some foundational, components of all of this that we've been gradually eroding long before the internet, actually. And we can see symptoms of it in universities, high schools, and elsewhere. So, just to repeat, I think this is a holistic challenge. There are a number of components, and yeah, we need to start now. Legislation, I mean, look what's happening right now in this hearing. It's supposed to be about Section 230. I'm no naive idealist here. I think the idea of opening up something like just Section 230 and examining it, and maybe debating it, is fraught with perils, right? This is going to be enormously complex. The platforms have a ton of money to throw at it, as you said, Kelly. They'll try to intervene. I mean, we just had Zuckerberg yesterday saying, yeah, I'd like to reform Section 230. Here's how we would do it, right? So it's a Pandora's box, all of that. I don't pretend that this is simple or easy, which is why I stayed away from very specific recommendations and focused on the underlying foundation.
Kelly, if we have just a minute, since I have sounded rather pessimistic, let me end on an optimistic note. The subtitle of Ron's book is Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, I believe, if I'm correct. And I actually would amend what I think the real message is, which is reclaiming the Internet for democracy by civil society. Ron is a leader in civil society in Canada and in global democratic circles. He's an exemplar and an inspiration to many of us. But I will just say, I am actually very hopeful about the democratic future in the United States. I think we are on the cusp now of an era of civil society-driven, grassroots mobilized democratic reform in the United States that will compare historically to the astonishing changes we achieved in the early 20th century during the progressive era in the United States, which was an era when we got anti-monopoly laws and very significant restraint of corporate greed. And I think we are going to see, pressed by civil society, in partnership with intellectual leaders and humanists like Ron Deibert, a new wave of creative and intelligent reform.
Thank you, Larry. Eileen, last thoughts?
So last thought quickly on your question about feasibility of regulation. I agree with Ron. Opening up 230, given the political division over that, is a Pandora's box and comes with risk. I would instead emphasize for the United States, federal privacy regulation that surpasses GDPR in its fundamental approach, and transparency and accountability for platforms, which to me is essential to civic education about what it means to live in a digitized society where algorithms are driving the information to you. That is a big piece of what's necessary. And I'm very happy to hear Larry is optimistic and really agree that citizens have to be at the heart of this. I don't think we can count on our government or the platforms.
Wonderful. Thank you all. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful to all of you for taking the time, and to Ron for you writing this fantastic book. So
thank you all. Yeah. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Eileen. Really appreciate it, and everybody for participating.
Yes, thanks everyone. We will have this up online for folks to share in the next couple of days. And then before fully closing, I'll just turn to some upcoming events. On 11/4, we will have our elections debrief. This should be a fantastic conversation with Nate Persily, Alex Stamos, Renee DiResta, Andy Grotto, Maricha Shake, Rob Reich, a whole host of folks here from the center. We will then have a conversation on the 18th with Frank Fukuyama and colleagues about new ideas in antitrust. On the 2nd, as Larry helpfully suggested and then alluded to earlier, we will have Sam Weinberg, Michael Caulfield, and a few other colleagues talking about digital literacy and what we know about how that is rolling out. And then we will have a half-day elections debrief with a wide range of scholars from Stanford and elsewhere, and representatives from the tech platforms on the 10th of December. So hope folks can join for any of those. And thank you all again today for taking the time. All right.
Bye, Ron.
Care.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.